Pokemon is a series centered around self-expression. With over 1,000 Pokemon in existence as of making this video, every trainer is able to create a team that is unique to them, while also styling an in-game character that suits them as well, creating an environment that is wholly unique to every individual player. This idea is not just represented in the player character either. This series is full of unique characters with incredible designs, fun personalities, or creative teams that make them memorable and give the world as a whole depth and life. While the series is, of course, focused on the creatures you catch in battle, the human characters are no slouches in terms of design and characterization either. Pokemon as a series has also been no stranger to featuring characters with gender expressions and implied sexualities that could be interpreted as queer, creating a richer world as a consequence. If you are up to date on the game series, you are probably familiar with some of these characters, but you may be surprised to hear that the inclusion of queer-coded and gender-non-conforming characters dates back to some of the earliest Pokemon media. In this video, I want to explore some of the human characters that have been implied to be queer throughout the history of Pokemon, because I believe that all players deserve to see themselves represented in one of the largest gaming franchises in the world. Before diving in though, I want to set a baseline understanding of what we will be discussing so that we are all on the same page. To begin, let's start with the obvious, which is that Pokemon is not a series about romance or necessarily learning much about other people. So it's incredibly rare that any character's sexuality or gender identity is revealed explicitly. However, many characters are queer-coded, which means they are given traits that are meant to signal that they are transgender, gender nonconforming, or not heterosexual. It's important to remember that while Pokemon is specifically created to be accessible to people of all ages, it still exists within the context of our culture and uses a shared understanding of gender norms to create characters that exist both within and outside of those gender norms. Like any work of fiction, something not being explicitly stated in text does not make it less valid or important to the story. That being said, this video is not about headcanons. While ultimately some of this is up to my own personal interpretation, I will only be discussing characters with either textual, artistic, or contextual evidence implying the writers intended them to be interpreted as queer in this video. Okay, with all of that out of the way, let's get into it. Starting from the early days of the series, one of the first transgender characters in the Pokemon series was introduced in the manga How I Became a Pokemon Card Volume 6, published in 2001. This was a series of manga that contained slice-of-life stories about various Pokemon cards, with each volume containing its own Pokemon card to go with it. In this particular story, titled Akari and Pikachu's Birthday, we meet a boy named Akari who wants to become a Pokemon Master with his friend. We discover that he was assigned female at birth, and his mother is desperately trying to get him to act like a girl, including wearing the female school uniform. Despite his objections, he is forced to wear it, even to the surprise of his friends, who never thought of him as anything other than a boy. When Akari sees that all of his classmates have gotten their own Pokemon, he asks his mother for one as well, even promising to act like a girl if that's what it takes, and she eventually relents. Upon receiving his very own Pikachu for his birthday, he's devastated since he wanted a cool Pokemon like his best friend Scyther, not a cute one like Pikachu. However, after being berated by his friend for being a jerk to Pikachu, and then Pikachu going on to defend them both from a group of wild Ariados, Akari accepts that Pikachu is cool after all. I think it's clear that this is a story about self-acceptance and self-expression in Akari's gender identity, despite his mother's harmful attitudes. Akari isn't the only queer character to come out of the manga either. Around that time, another series called Gold and Silver: The Golden Boys was released, chronicling Gold's journey through Johto. In it, he meets the gym leader Bugsy, who very clearly takes a liking to Gold right away, acting pretty flirtatiously towards him, highlighted by his frequent blushing around Gold. This is a much more implied level of coding than with Akari in the previous manga, but I don't think you need to squint too hard to see that Bugsy clearly has a crush on Gold. A few years later, in 2003 here in the US, the third generation of Pokemon was ushered in by the release of Ruby and Sapphire. While those games introduced two of the most queer-coded characters in the series, they will have to wait until later in this video, as both of their characters receive a lot of much needed development in the remakes. Of course, with every new generation of games comes a new anime series, and in the Pokemon series Advance, we are introduced to Harley, a Pokemon coordinator who serves as a rival for May. He is very flamboyant and is shown to have a crush on Norman and flirt with Brock, so I think it's fair to say his sexuality is at the very least not straight, and he certainly doesn't adhere to traditional gender stereotypes. He is often conniving, petty, and willing to use public humiliation and sabotage to get what he wants, which might have landed him in the familiar bucket of queer-coded villains, if not for some more endearing moments where he puts aside his rivalry with May for the greater good. Ultimately, his characterization does veer into gay trope territory, but he's not too unlikable, and does add some flavor to the Hoenn anime series. With this era of Pokemon coming to an end, it's clear to see that queer characters have been a part of Pokemon history from the very beginning. While the quality of the representation is often a product of its time, it's heartening to know that as someone who grew up in this era of Pokemon, stories that queer people could especially relate to were being told, even if they were somewhat few and far between. Unfortunately, those stories would continue to be told as the series grew. It would be quite a few more years until we saw our next canonically queer character in the series. In that time, 3 generations would pass, hundreds of Pokemon would be introduced, and the series would transition to 3D in the 2013 release of Pokemon X and Y. Taking place in the beautiful Kalos region, this game introduces the first canonically transgender character in the game series, albeit a very minor one. You can encounter this character, Beauty Nova, in the Battle Maison. After defeating her, she tells you that just 6 months ago, she used to be a black belt. It's important to note here that a Beauty is a female-only trainer class and a black belt is a male-only trainer class, meaning that 6 months ago she would have identified as male. This is further backed up in the Japanese version of the game, where Nova comments that the power of medical science is awesome, implying that she had gender-affirming surgery. While this is a small Easter egg and unfortunately somewhat censored in the English version of the game, it nonetheless shows queer Pokemon trainers in regular, everyday roles in the games, which I think is a positive development. A year later, the Generation 3 remakes, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, would be released. These games updated a lot of aspects of the Hoenn region, including more development for certain characters who needed it the most. One of these characters was Wallace, who in this game serves as the gym leader of Sutopolis City, having been demoted from champion by Steven Stone. I think it goes without saying that Wallace's outfit is pretty flamboyant, which is certainly on brand for someone who is very involved in Pokemon contests. However, his characterization goes beyond just that. In the mobile spin-off game Pokemon Masters, it's heavily implied that Wallace and Steven are in a relationship given Barry's comment about it, as well as the fact that they were featured together in a Valentine's Day event. Combined with their seemingly close relationship in the main games, and Wallace's overall demeanor, you don't have to look too closely to see that they are likely meant to be seen as a couple. This is pretty substantial for the series in my opinion, given how few canonical romantic relationships there are between important characters in the series. We also see a few regular trainers in ORAS that are seemingly implied to be couples. One of the funniest examples of this is the 2 women in Seamawville who have locked themselves in a room and are surprised you got in. If you talk to one of them, they are just blushing, and the other insists that they are only in there to learn how to battle Pokemon. Sure, whatever you say. The other couple can be found on Route 117, where they challenge you to a double battle. Before the battle starts, one of the girls says that they want to impress their cute teammate, and the other girl says they want to impress their beautiful teammate, clearly referring to each other. These 2 and the couple from Seamawville are obviously small examples, but worth pointing out all the same because, like Beauty Nova, they show queer characters simply existing in the Pokemon world. Finally, the last characters in this era come from the smash hit spin-off game, Pokemon Go. It's more likely than not that you have played this game, but as a refresher, there are 3 teams within the game that the player chooses: Mystic, Instinct, and Valor. The leader of Team Mystic is Blanche, whose gender identity is likely meant to be non-binary as they use they/them pronouns. While they are referred to using feminine pronouns in languages without an equivalent to the English they, this is apparently a common practice in those languages and thus doesn't invalidate their identity. Similarly, Ri, another character from Go, also has an assumed non-binary identity and uses they/them pronouns. It's heartening to know that an openly gender non-conforming character was given such a pivotal role in one of the series' most popular games. Ultimately, the generation spanning from Sinnoh to Alola ended up being fairly consequential in terms of queer representation, as it was in this time frame that the first canonically queer people were featured in the games, as well as introducing several other iconic characters across the media franchise. As we'll soon see, this trend will continue on into the present day across the games and other Pokemon media that have been released in the last few years. With the 8th generation of Pokemon ushered in with the release of Sword and Shield, as always, a new series of the anime also debuted. Pokemon Journeys featured Ash and his new companion Go as they traveled across the mainland Pokemon regions at the time. From the earliest announcements of the series, there was speculation about Go's gender, given his more androgynous look. I debated with myself on whether to include Go in this video, but ultimately, I think it's clear that the writers and artists intended Go to have a gender expression that towed the line between masculine and feminine, not strictly adhering to the gender norms of either. Whereas some characters in the series have outfits or color schemes that might stray from gender norms, they are usually intended to match their team's typing or overall theme. Go's gender expression, on the other hand, seems to serve no other purpose other than being how he likes to present himself, which ultimately provides positive representation for people who also prefer to not strictly adhere to gender norms, thus making him worth including in this video. As the 8th generation came to a close and we started receiving information about the new Paldea games, it became clear that Game Freak was starting to become much more open with the gender expressions of the characters in their games. While many games in the series have 1 or 2 characters who slightly deviate from the gender norms without any other evidence that the writers intended them to be perceived as queer, like Beat from Galar or Berg from Unova for example, Generation 9 made a point of making several characters like this, so I think it's worth pointing out. From Grusha, the feminine snowboarder who identifies as a male, to Ortega, the boy who is dressed head to toe in pastel pink, to Rika, the masculine-dressing female Elite Four member, and more, it's clear that including characters with gender expressions outside the norm was not just a one-off, but a purposeful through line in many of the characters in this region. Does that make them queer? Well, that's not for me to decide, but it certainly portrays gender non-conforming people in important positions, creating positive representation, which to me is incredibly important. It's clear to me that with the Galar and Paldea eras, Game Freak and the Pokemon Company are becoming much more comfortable portraying gender non-conforming characters. The Pokemon games of this era have sold the best since the 1st generation, meaning that the player base is as diverse as ever. And I think it's only fair that this diversity should also be reflected in the characters themselves. So after all of that, you may still be wondering why any of this matters. Who cares if a random character from an early Pokemon manga might have been trans, or if Steven and Wallace are a couple? It doesn't really make any difference to the gameplay or story of any of the games or anime. And to that I would say, it does actually make a difference. It's been shown time and time again that representation in media is important for the mental health of minority groups. And as the largest media franchise in the world, Pokemon has a big part to play in that. As an adult, I certainly don't turn to games like Pokemon for accurate portrayals of queer characters, but my life revolved around this franchise as a child. And as the first media franchise many people get into, they deserve to feel seen. By taking a look through the history of the series, I think it's interesting to see that queer characters have been with us since the very early days. even if the quality of that representation hasn't always been the best. Like I said at the beginning of the video, Pokemon is about self-expression, and I have hope that Game Freak and Nintendo are making progress not only on the player's self-expression, but through highlighting characters that exist outside of traditional gender norms. And I'm excited to see what's in store in the future of Pokemon media. Let me know what you think though. Pokemon is such a massive series that it's completely possible that I missed a few characters along the way, and if so, let me know in the comments. As always, thank you all for watching. This video was such a pleasure to make, so if you liked it, please consider subscribing, and I'll catch you next time.